The town of redemption baked under a sun that offered no mercy. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything: the sagging porches of the saloon, the false fronts of the general store, and the sweat-slicked necks of horses tied to the hitching posts. It was a town teeming with the desperate hopes of men seeking fortune, a frantic energy that pulsed just beneath the grime. For Jedediah Kane, it was just another stop on a road he believed had no end. At 20, he was all sharp angles and restless energy, his gun belt slung low on his hips with the casual arrogance of a young man who had learned too early that speed and nerve were a form of currency. He stood with the rest of them in the shade of the livery, listening to Silas lay out the plan. Silas was the core around which their gang orbited, a man whose quiet, almost gentle voice was a chilling counterpoint to the coldness in his eyes. He spoke of the Redemption Bank's payroll delivery as if he were discussing the weather, his words calm and precise. 2 guards inside, one on the street, Silas murmured, tracing a map in the dust with the toe of his boot. We go in as the noon bell rings. The sound will cover our entry. Jedediah, you and Pike take the street. Keep it clear. No heroes, no mistakes. We are ghosts, in and out before they know what's happened. Jedediah nodded, the familiar coil of adrenaline tightening in his gut. He was good at this. The chaos, the flash of a drawn gun, the moment of sharp, terrifying clarity, when everything slowed down and only survival mattered. He had mistaken it for living. Pike, a heavy-set man whose face was a roadmap of saloon brawls, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Jedediah's boot. Just make sure you point that iron straight, kid. Last time you nearly took my ear off. Jedediah's hand instinctively brushed the worn handle of his Colt. My aim's true enough, Pike. Just make sure you don't trip over your own feet. The noon bell began its toll, a deep, clanging clangor that vibrated through the wooden sidewalks. It was the signal. Silas gave a curt nod, and they moved, dissolving into the midday foot traffic. Jedediah and Pike took their positions across from the bank, leaning against a water trough as if they had all the time in the world. Jedediah's eyes scanned the street. A mother pulling her child away from a stray dog. 2 prospectors arguing over the price of whiskey. And directly next to the bank, a small tailor shop. A sign hanging from a wrought iron bracket read, Croft's Fine Tailoring. Through the clean glass window he could see a man inside, bent over a sewing machine, and a woman arranging a bolt of blue calico fabric. A little girl, no older than 5, played with scraps on the floor. A family. A life so alien to his own, it might as well have been on another planet. The first shot from inside the bank cracked the midday calm. The bell was still ringing, but this new sound was sharper, more final. A woman screamed. The prospectors dove for cover. Jedediah drew his pistol, the movement a fluid, practiced arc. Pike was already firing into the air, his booming shots meant to sow panic. Stay back, Jedediah yelled, his voice raw. This ain't your fight. But there was always a hero. A young deputy, barely old enough to shave, burst out of the sheriff's office, his face a mask of terror and determination. He fumbled with his gun, trying to aim it at Silas's men as they emerged from the bank with heavy satchels. Don't be a fool, boy, Jedediah shouted, leveling his pistol. He didn't want to kill him. A warning shot. That's all it needed to be. He aimed for the wall beside the deputy, a shot to splinter wood and shatter nerve. He fired. The Colt bucked in his hand, but in that same instant, a runaway horse, panicked by the gunfire, bolted past, jostling a stack of barrels. The deputy stumbled back right into the path of the bullet. It wasn't a clean miss. The slug ricocheted off a metal hitching post with a high-pitched whine, a sound like a vicious insect. Jedediah watched its trajectory in a distorted, horrifying slice of time. The bullet, spent but still lethal, flew across the street and smashed through the window of the tailor shop. It struck an oil lamp perched on a shelf. The glass exploded. The lamp toppled, spilling its burning contents onto the bolt of blue calico the woman had been holding. The fabric ignited with a whoosh, a sheet of blue and orange flame climbing the walls in an instant. The woman screamed a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. The little girl shrieked her mother's name. Jedediah froze his gun, feeling like a block of ice in his hand. Through the smoke and growing inferno, he saw their faces, the mother beating at the flames on her dress, the father trying to shield his daughter. Trapped. Jedediah, move. It was Silas, his voice a blade cutting through the haze of horror. He grabbed Jedediah's arm, yanking him toward the horses. We're leaving now. But Jedediah couldn't tear his eyes from the fire. The screams were changing, becoming choked, desperate. The tailor, his face blackened with soot, appeared at the shattered window, his mouth open in a silent plea. The woman, her hair now a crown of fire, stumbled out of the shop's doorway, reaching clawing at the air. She blundered right into Jedediah as Silas dragged him past. He shoved her away, a reflexive, panicked motion. His fingers caught on the delicate chain around her neck. It snapped. Something small and cool fell into his palm. He didn't have time to look. Silas threw him onto his horse. Ride! He roared, his face a mask of fury. They're dead, it's done, ride. They galloped out of Redemption, the posse's answering gunfire, a distant pop, pop, pop behind them. Jedediah didn't look back, but he didn't have to. The image of the burning shop was seared onto the inside of his eyelids. The smell of smoke and burning cloth filled his lungs. The screams echoed in his skull, a chorus of ghosts he had created with a single, careless shot. Later that night, miles away in a hidden canyon, the gang counted their spoils by the light of a campfire. They laughed and drank, celebrating their victory. But Jedediah sat apart, the sickness in his stomach, a living thing. The fire from their camp cast dancing shadows that looked like flames licking at the canyon walls. He opened his hand. Lying in his palm was a small silver locket, oval-shaped and engraved with the initials E.C. It was dented from the fall, but it gleamed in the firelight. He had torn it from a dead woman's neck. Silas came over, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. Drink up, Jedediah. You did good today, a little messy but profitable. He glanced at the locket. A souvenir, toss it. It's bad luck to keep things from the dead. Jedediah closed his fist around it, the metal biting into his skin. He looked at Silas, at the man's unfeeling eyes, and saw the empty road stretching out before him. It was a path of more robberies, more fires, more ghosts. A path he could no longer walk. I'm done, he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. Silas's smile faded. What did you say? I'm out. For a long moment, Silas just stared at him. Then he let out a short, harsh laugh. There's no out, boy. You're one of us. You run, we'll find you. You've got a share in this. You've got blood on your hands, same as the rest of us. Jedediah rose to his feet. He left his share of the money untouched by the fire. He kept only the locket. Keep it, he said. I've got more than I can carry as it is. He turned and walked to his horse without looking back. He expected a bullet in his back. He almost welcomed it. But none came. He swung into the saddle and rode out of the canyon, leaving the fire and the laughter behind. He rode for days, fueled by guilt and self-loathing, until the name Jedediah Kane felt like a stranger's coat he had shrugged off. He rode until he was just a man adrift in the vast, indifferent wilderness. He called himself Cade, a name as empty and stark as the life he now sought. Years bled into one another each sunrise, a fresh reminder of the debt he could never repay. The silver locket remained in his saddlebag, a cold, constant penance. Cade drifted, taking work where he could find it mending fences on a sprawling ranch in the north, breaking horses in the territories, even guarding a payroll wagon, once the irony a bitter taste in his mouth. He learned to speak less, to listen more, to keep his gaze lowered and his hands busy. The restless energy of Jedediah Kane had hardened into the quiet vigilance of Cade, a man who walked as if expecting the ground to give way beneath him. His journey led him south to a land where the sun-bleached grass stretched to the horizon, a shimmering sea of broken glass under a vast, indifferent sky. The air was so hot it tasted of dust and iron. It was a place of profound solitude, a landscape that mirrored the emptiness inside him. It was here, at the end of a barely there track, that he found her homestead. It wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin of rough-hewn timber, a barn leaning with the prevailing wind, and a patchwork of fenced-in land that looked like a stubborn fist clenched against the sprawling emptiness. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin gray thread, against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It was a picture of survival, not prosperity. As he drew closer, he saw a woman splitting wood near the cabin. She moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, her shoulders set, her face shaded by a worn straw hat. She was lean and sun-browned, her strength evident in the clean swing of the axe. When she heard his horses approach, she didn't startle. She simply stopped, rested the axe head on the chopping block, and turned. Her hand drifted to the rifle propped against the cabin wall. Cade pulled his horse to a halt, a respectful distance from her porch. He saw the weariness in the lines around her eyes, but also a resilience as unyielding as the hard-packed earth beneath her feet. He removed his hat, a gesture that felt foreign after years of keeping to himself. The setting sun caught the faint scar on his jawline. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low gravel rough from disuse. "Don't mean to trouble you. Just need a place to water my horse and maybe a roof over my head for the night if you've got one to spare." She studied him for a long, silent moment. Her eyes, the color of moss in a shaded creek, took in his worn coat and the dust on his boots, the way he held himself still, but not relaxed like a coiled snake. A woman alone on the frontier learned to read men, like she read the weather, looking for signs of a coming storm. "Water's out back by the trough," she answered, her voice direct and pragmatic with no room for pleasantries. She didn't move from the rifle. "The cabin's mine and I don't open it to strangers easy." "You got a name, mister?" He hesitated. The question always felt like a judgment. "Call me Cade." It was a name, but it wasn't an answer. She seemed to understand that. Her gaze lingered on him, a weighing, a measuring. He could be an outlaw, a drifter, or worse. But in the deep shadows of his eyes, she saw not malice, but a sorrow so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. He dismounted with a quiet grace, his movements deliberate. He led his horse to the trough, pumping the handle until fresh, cool water spilled into the basin. He tended to his animal first, a sign of a man who understood the priorities of the trail. Only then did he approach the porch, stopping short of the steps, a clear acknowledgement of her boundaries. The silence stretched, filled only by the moan of the prairie wind through the cottonwoods. He waited for her verdict. Finally, she gave a short, sharp nod and lowered her head toward the rifle. One night, she set her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. "You sleep by the hearth, and you keep your hands where I can see them." A trace of relief softened his features. "I don't bring trouble where it ain't welcome." He inclined his head. "Thank you, ma'am." "Clara," she corrected him, turning to pick up her axe. "My name is Clara Donnelly." That night, as storm clouds gathered and the first patter of rain touched the windows, Clara found herself glancing more than once at the stranger. He sat across the fire-lit cabin, his presence filling the small space in a way that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. He didn't speak much, but his silence wasn't empty. It was watchful, heavy with things left unsaid. For the first time since illness had carried off her parents the previous winter, leaving her with nothing but the sagging homestead and her own stubborn grit, Clara felt she was not entirely alone. And that realization stirred something deep inside her, something that frightened her far more than the wild, empty land outside her door. The town of Providence was a day's ride from Clara's homestead, a muddy, burgeoning settlement that served as the hub for the scattered farms and ranches in the territory. It had one main street, a saloon that smelled of stale whiskey, and regret a general store, and a new half-built church whose naked timbers reached toward the sky like a skeleton's prayer. It was into this town, a month after Cade's arrival at the Donnelly homestead, that a man named Silas Croft rode. He did not arrive like a common drifter. He came in a polished black buggy pulled by two matching gray horses, wearing a tailored suit the color of charcoal. His hair was silver at the temples, and his smile was easy and engaging. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to power, and within a week he had rented the largest office in town above the land registrar and hung a shingle that read, Providence Development Company. His arrival was a gust of fresh wind in a stagnant room. He spoke to the ranchers and homesteaders about the future, about the railroad that was rumored to be coming through, about prosperity. He offered to buy land at prices that seemed more than fair. And he spoke with a sly, articulate charm that disarmed even the most suspicious old-timers. This land is on the cusp of greatness, he'd say, his voice smooth and persuasive. But progress requires investment. It requires a singular vision. Clara first heard of him at the general store where she'd ridden to trade eggs for flour and salt. The storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson, was full of the news. This Mr. Croft, he's buying up the Miller place and the old Johnson claim too. Paying in cash, says he's going to build a new hotel, a proper one. Clara listened, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She'd seen men like this before, men who spoke of progress, but left ruin in their wake. Their promises were traps, their smiles masks. Progress for who, Mr. Henderson? She asked quietly. For him or for us? Henderson just shrugged, too dazzled by the shine of new money to see the shadows it cast. The pressure began subtly. The price of feed at the general store went up. The cost of shipping goods to the nearest major town suddenly doubled. Small inconveniences designed to make the hard life of a homesteader just a little harder. Clara, fiercely independent, dug in her heels. She would make do. She always had. But Silas Croft's methods were more direct than simple economics. He wanted her land. It was situated on a rise overlooking a shallow creek, a prime location. He had sent a man to make her an offer, which she had politely but firmly refused. This land was my parents', she'd said. It's not for sale. A week later, she went to the well to draw her morning water and found the bucket came up empty. The rope had been cut, the pulley mechanism smashed. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced her. Without water, her livestock would die. She would be forced to abandon the homestead. For a moment she felt the crushing weight of her solitude, the sheer impossibility of her struggle. She was standing there, staring down into the dark, dry shaft, when Cade came up behind her. He had seen the grim set of her jaw. He looked at the broken pulley, then at her face. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. I can fix it, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. It'll take time. We'll have to haul water from the creek until I can rig a new system. The simple, practical statement was more reassuring than any promise. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. They did this on purpose. I know, he said, his eyes dark. That's why we're going to fix it. It took them 3 days of back-breaking labor. Cade, using skills she hadn't known he possessed, fashioned a new pulley from a sturdy piece of oak and painstakingly spliced the severed rope. He worked with a focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. As they worked, Clara saw more than just a drifter. She saw a man who understood how things were put together and how they could be broken. On the 3rd afternoon, as Cade was lowering the new mechanism into the well, 2 men rode up. They were rough-looking, with the lazy arrogance of men who worked for a powerful boss. "Having some trouble, ma'am?" one of them asked, a sneer playing on his lips. "Mr. Croft heard about your predicament. Sent us to say his offer still stands. Might be easier to sell than to keep fixing things that break." Cade slowly straightened up from the well, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He positioned himself between the men and Clara, a silent, immovable barrier. "She's not selling," he said, his voice flat and cold. The man chuckled. "And who are you, her new husband?" "I'm the man telling you to ride on," Cade replied. The threat in his tone was unmistakable, a low hum of violence beneath the quiet words. The men exchanged a look, sizing him up. They saw the breadth of his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw, and the chilling stillness in his eyes. They were bullies, not fighters. They muttered a curse and wheeled their horses around, kicking up dust as they left. Clara watched them go, her heart pounding. She turned to Cade, whose gaze was still fixed on the retreating riders. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded, turning back to the well, as if the confrontation had been a minor distraction. But Clara knew it wasn't. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had chosen a side, and in doing so, he had brought the full, unwelcome attention of Silas Croft directly upon them. Later that week, Sheriff Brody rode out to the homestead. He was a grizzled old man with a weary face and a tin star that had long since lost its shine. He chewed on an unlit cigar, his eyes scanning the property. "Heard you had some trouble out here, Clara," he said, his voice tired. He glanced at Cade. "And that you've got yourself some help." "Mr. Croft's men broke my well," Clara stated plainly. Sheriff Brody sighed a long, drawn-out sound of resignation. He looked at Cade. "Son, a word of advice. Men like Croft, they're like a river in flood. You can't stand in their way. You just get out of the path or you get swept under. This ain't your fight. It'd be best for everyone if you just moved on." "Is that a warning?" Sheriff Cade asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's a kindness," Brody replied, not meeting his eye. "Some storms you just can't ride out. For your own good, I'd be on the next horizon by morning." He tipped his hat to Clara and rode off, leaving his words hanging in the air like a bad omen. The sheriff's visit confirmed what Cade already suspected. Silas Croft owned this town from its businesses to its lawman. And he, a nameless drifter, had just made himself an obstacle. In the weeks that followed, the homestead became an island in a hostile sea. The pressure from Silas Croft intensified, but Cade and Clara met it with a shared unspoken resolve. A fragile rhythm had settled between them, a partnership forged in adversity. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their days filled with the hard, honest labor of survival. Cade repaired the barn roof that had sagged for years. Clara, in turn, mended his worn coat, her stitches small and neat. Their conversations remained sparse, but a deeper understanding grew in the silences. In the evenings, they would sit by the hearth and the firelight casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a living thing, charged and expectant. Clara found herself watching him, the way the light carved shadows across the harsh planes of his face, the quiet sadness that never quite left his eyes. She would ask him questions she hadn't voiced in years. Questions about the world beyond her small patch of land. "Did you have family?" she asked one night, her voice soft. Cade's gaze remained fixed on the flames. A long pause stretched between them. "I had a brother once," he said finally, his voice rough. "He chose a different path, a better one. He offered no more his words, a locked door. He spoke of places he'd been, the bitter cold of the northern mountains, the suffocating heat of the southern deserts, but never of the people he'd known or the reasons he'd left. He was a man made of carefully constructed walls." In return, she found herself speaking of her parents, of the suffocating loneliness that had followed their passing. She spoke of her dream, not of wealth, but of simple peace, of seeing her parents' land flourish. She expected pity the way most people offered it, as a cheap and useless coin. Instead, Cade looked at her with something sharper, something that felt like admiration. "You're tougher than most men I've known," he said, his deep voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. He finally turned his gaze from the flames to her. "Tougher and still softer than you let on." The word startled her, sending a flush of heat to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. She turned away, pretending to fuss with the kindling, but her heart thudded with a treacherous warmth she had no business feeling. Cade became increasingly suspicious of Silas Croft. The man's ambition felt too personal, his methods too cruel for a simple land grab. One afternoon, Cade rode into Providence, telling Clara he needed to buy nails. His real purpose was to watch to listen. He sat in the back of the saloon, nursing a single whiskey, and observed Croft holding court. The man was charismatic, his words painting a grand vision for the town's future. But Cade saw something else beneath the polished veneer, a chilling intensity, an obsessive focus that seemed directed at the town's very soul. As Croft was leaving the saloon, something fell from his coat pocket. It was a small folded object. Cade watched as Croft bent to retrieve it, his movements stiff. For a moment under the lamplight, Cade saw it clearly, a piece of dark wool, its edges singed and blackened by fire. Croft smoothed it out with a strange reverence before tucking it carefully back into his pocket. The sight sent a jolt through Cade, a cold shock of misplaced familiarity. A singed piece of fabric, a tailor's shop. The memory, long buried under years of guilt, clawed its way to the surface. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. It was a coincidence. Redemption was a ghost town now, a collection of burnt-out husks half a territory away. No one from that life could have found him here. And yet the unease lingered. He began to see shadows of his past in the present. Croft's calculated destruction of the town's spirit felt like a slow-burning fire consuming everything in its path. Cade felt the old impulse to run to ride until this new life was just another memory. He could disappear before Croft's attention became lethal, before he dragged Clara down with him. But then he would see her. Her face set with determination as she pulled weeds from her small garden, her quiet strength a constant grounding presence. He was drawn to her, to the fragile hope she represented. The affection between them was a slow thawing river, a current running deep and powerful beneath a surface of ice. When their hands brushed as he passed her a tool, a jolt of awareness passed between them, sharp and undeniable. He saw the answering flicker in her eyes before she looked away. He was torn. To stay meant putting her in the path of a danger he was only beginning to understand. To leave meant abandoning the only person who had ever looked at him and not seen a ghost. One evening, as they sat in their usual silence by the fire, he heard Croft's name mentioned in town again. He had bought out the blacksmith, forcing him to leave. Another piece of the community hollowed out. Clara noticed his turmoil. "What is it, Cade?" she asked, her voice gentle. "What's troubling you so?" He looked at her, at the genuine concern in her face, and the truth almost spilled out of him, and the fire, the gang, the name Jedediah Cain. But the words caught in his throat. How could he burden her with the ugliness of his past? How could he expect her to look at him the same way again? It's nothing, he lied, turning back to the fire. Just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a gathering storm, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was coming for him. The storm broke on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the air was heavy with the charged stillness that precedes violence. Cade was reinforcing the fence on the far side of the property when he saw the lone rider approaching. It wasn't one of the usual thugs. This rider sat tall in the saddle, his posture relaxed and confident. It was Silas Croft. Cade dropped his tools and walked to meet him at the edge of the property line. His stance a clear warning not to cross. Clara, sensing the shift in the air, came out onto the porch, her rifle held loosely in her hands. Silas dismounted, leaving his horse's reins to trail on the ground. He smiled a polite, civilized expression that didn't reach his eyes. He was dressed impeccably, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. A fine piece of land, he began, his voice conversational. It takes a strong will to carve a life out of this place. A will I can appreciate. It's not for sale, Croft. Cade said, his voice low and flat. Silas's smile widened slightly. He ignored Cade for a moment, his gaze shifting to the cabin, to Clara, then back. His eyes cold and gray, as river stones settled on Cade's face, a flicker of something dark and ancient passing through them. He took a step closer. I'm not here about the land, he said softly, the charm falling away from his voice like a snake shedding its skin. I'm here for you. Jedediah Cain. The name hit Cade like a physical blow. A name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 7 years. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the blood draining from his face. Every muscle in his body went rigid. On the porch, he heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. Silas watched his reaction with a look of immense satisfaction. Ah, he breathed. So you do remember? I wondered. I've been looking for you for a very long time. I almost didn't recognize you. You've hardened. The years have not been kind. Good. Cade's mind reeled. The singed fabric. The obsessive destruction of Providence. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Redemption. Cade whispered the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. Yes, Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a venom that had been brewing for years. Redemption. A fitting name for a town where I lost everything. He reached into his coat and pulled out the singed piece of wool. He held it out. This was a piece of my daughter's dress. I was making it for her birthday. Do you remember her? She had hair the color of corn silk. Her name was Ellie. My wife's name was Eleanor. The ghosts Cade had tried to outrun for 7 years were suddenly standing before him, given names and faces by the man he had wronged. The tailor. The man from the shop. My business dealings. Silas continued, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, are a prelude. I wanted this town to die slowly. I wanted its hope to curdle into despair. I wanted you isolated with nowhere to run. I wanted you to have something to lose before I took it all away, just like you took everything from me. He gestured toward Clara, a sweep of his hand that was both dismissive and possessive. This woman, this land, this pathetic little life you've tried to build on my family's ashes. It's all forfeit. The conflict was no longer about land or money. It was a reckoning, deeply personal and utterly inescapable. Cade felt the weight of his past crash down on him, and the guilt, a physical presence choking the air from his lungs. He was no longer Cade, the quiet homesteader. He was Jedediah Cain, the careless outlaw who had set the world on fire. "What do you want?" Cade asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. Silas's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Want," he hissed. "I want to burn it all down. I want you to watch as I take this woman from you. I want you to feel the same helpless agony I felt as I listened to my wife and child scream your name while your gang leader dragged you to safety. I don't want your life, Jedediah. I want your soul." He turned, then his movements calm and deliberate, and mounted his horse. "It's coming," he said, looking back at Cade one last time. "The fire is coming for you." He rode away, leaving Cade standing in the oppressive silence, the world irrevocably shattered. He could feel Clara's eyes on him from the porch, her gaze filled with questions and a dawning horror. He couldn't bring himself to turn to face her. The man she had come to know was a lie, and the truth, the real truth of Jedediah Kane, was about to destroy them both. The hours after Silas's departure were a silent, agonizing crucible. Cade stood frozen by the fence line long after the dust from Silas's horse had settled, trapped in the wreckage of his past. The sky grew darker, the air thick and heavy. When he finally turned, he saw Clara still on the porch, her rifle held at her side, her face pale. The space between them, once filled with unspoken affection, was now a chasm of secrets and shame. He walked toward her, each step a leaden weight. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, unable to meet her eyes. "You should have let me ride on that first day," he said, his voice hollow. "Jedediah Kane," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. The name sounded alien on her lips. "Is that who you are?" "It's who I was," he ground out. "It's the ghost that follows me." He told her everything. He spared none of the ugly details: the gang, the robbery, the stray bullet, the fire. He spoke of the screams, the locket he still carried, and the 7 years he had spent running from the man he used to be. He laid the entirety of his sins at her feet, expecting disgust, hatred, fear. He expected her to tell him to leave, to banish him from this small sanctuary he had so completely defiled. When he finished, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rising wind that whispered through the cottonwoods. He finally dared to look at her. There was no hatred in her eyes. There was shock and pain, but beneath it something else. A profound, aching sadness. "The man who told me that story is not the man who fixed my well," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "Or the man who stood against Croft's bullies. Or the man who has spent every day here trying to build instead of break. That man brought this down on you, Clara." He rasped, his guilt of physical torment. "Silas is right. I built this life on the ashes of his." "No," she said, stepping down to stand before him. She reached out her hand, hesitating before gently touching the scar on his jaw. "You built it on your own hope for something better. You are not the boy who fired that gun. You are the man who has spent 7 years regretting it. That has to matter." Her forgiveness was a blow more staggering than any condemnation. It was a grace he felt he had no right to accept. Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drumming against the hard-packed earth reached them. It was a single rider, coming fast. It was Henderson, the storekeeper from Providence, his face ashen with panic. "Cade, Clara," he gasped, pulling his horse to a skidding halt. "It's Croft. He's gone crazy. He and his men, they've taken Doc Miller." Doc Miller was a kind, elderly man who had treated Cade's bruised ribs after a fall with gentle hands and no questions asked. He was one of the few people in town who had shown him simple decency. "What happened?" Cade demanded, his hands clenching into fists. Croft rode into town shouting that the time for payment had come. Henderson stammered, his eyes wide with terror. He said the town sheltered a murderer. He dragged Doc Miller from his office, said he was an accomplice. He's taking him to the half-built church. He says he's going to burn it to the ground with the doctor inside, unless Jedediah Kane comes to face him. Alone. The ultimatum was as cruel as it was brilliant. Silas wasn't just forcing a confrontation, he was making the entire town Cade's executioner. If Cade didn't go, an innocent man would die, and the town would turn on him. If he did go, he would be walking into a trap alone. He said to come by midnight. Henderson finished, his voice cracking. He's got men posted all around. There's no way to get in unseen. Cade's choice was gone. His past had not only caught up with him, it had wrapped its chains around everything he had come to care for. He looked at Clara, his face a grim mask of resolve. This was his reckoning. His alone. I'm going, he said. No, Clara said, her voice ringing with iron. You're not going alone. Clara, this is my fight. He wants me. He threatened this town. He threatened our friend. He threatened our home, she corrected him, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched his own. It's our fight now. He thinks you're alone. He thinks this town will abandon you. He's wrong. She turned to Henderson. Go back. Tell the others. Don't fight, not yet. But be ready. Henderson nodded, a flicker of courage returning to his eyes, and galloped back toward Providence. Clara turned back to Cade. The wind was whipping her hair across her face, and the first drops of rain began to fall. A storm was coming, a real one this time, to match the one in their hearts. He wants to burn everything down, she said. Let's give him a fight he won't forget. In her unwavering gaze, Cade saw not just a woman defending her home, but a partner who refused to let him face his demons by himself. The guilt remained a permanent scar on his soul, but for the first time, it was outweighed by something else. A fierce, burning need to protect the future she had made him believe was possible. The dust storm hit just after nightfall, a monstrous churning wall of sand and grit that swallowed the landscape. It was a biblical force, turning the world into a maelstrom of howling wind and stinging darkness. To Cade, it felt like the sky itself was mirroring the chaos in his soul. It was under the cover of this raging tempest that he and Clara made their way toward Providence. They couldn't ride. The horses would panic. They walked heads bowed against the gale, the wind tearing at their clothes and scouring their skin. He'll be at the church, Cade yelled over the roar of the storm. It's symbolic, a house of God for a final judgment. Clara knotted her hand tight on the stock of her rifle. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve was harder. They moved through the town's deserted streets like phantoms, the storm providing a perfect chaotic cloak for their approach. Lanterns swayed violently, casting wild, distorted shadows. The half-built church stood on a small hill at the edge of town, its timber frame a skeletal silhouette against the tumultuous sky. Light spilled from its open doorway, a single defiant eye in the storm. Cade could see the shapes of Croft's men huddled against the walls, trying to shield themselves from the dust. There are 4 outside, Cade whispered, his voice gritty with sand. 2 more inside, at least. And the sheriff. How do we get to the doctor? Clara asked. We don't, Cade said grimly. This isn't about rescue. It's about confrontation. I draw them out. You find a position, watch my back, and if it goes bad, you get out. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice fierce. He looked at her, then her face smudged with dirt, her eyes burning with an intensity that stole his breath. He reached out and gripped her arm. Clara, this ends tonight, one way or another. Live. For me. Before she could argue, he slipped away into the swirling dust. He circled around the back of the church, moving with the silent grace of a predator. He took out the 2 guards at the rear with swift, brutal efficiency, not killing them, but disabling them with blows that were precise and final. Then he walked around to the front, stepping into the light of the doorway. He was a specter emerging from the storm. "Croft," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the wind. "I'm here. Let the doctor go." Inside the church, Silas Croft stood near the half-finished altar, a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Doc Miller was tied to one of the main support beams, his face bruised and bleeding. Sheriff Brody stood near Croft, his own gun drawn, his face a portrait of weary complicity. Jedediah Silas purred his smile, a terrifying slash in the lantern light. Always so dramatic. Punctual, though. I'll grant you that. He gestured with his pistol. "Come in. Join the sermon." As Cade stepped inside, the 2 guards by the door moved to block his exit. The wind howled through the open-ribbed structure, causing the lanterns to swing wildly and the timbers to groan. Dust and debris rained down from the unfinished roof. "It's between you and me," Silas Cade said, his eyes locked on his enemy. "Let Miller and Brody go." Silas laughed, a sound that was sharp and brittle. "Oh, the sheriff isn't going anywhere." "Are you Brody?" "He's been a most valuable asset. Kept me informed of your every move. It's amazing what a man will do for a little money and a quiet life." Sheriff Brody flinched, refusing to meet Cade's gaze. The secondary betrayal was a dull, aching blow. They were truly alone. "As for the doctor," Silas continued, "he represents the goodness you tried to cling to. This town's decency. And like everything else you've touched, it will turn to ash." He raised the lantern. Next to Doc Miller was a pile of oil-soaked rags. "A poetic end, don't you think? Another fire. Another innocent life consumed because of you." A loud groan echoed through the structure as a massive gust of wind tore at the roof. A heavy beam splintered overhead. The church was coming apart around them. "You won't win," Silas Cade said, slowly walking forward. "This isn't redemption for you. It's just hate. It's all you have left." "It's enough," Silas shrieked, his composure finally cracking. He lunged for the rags with the lantern. In that instant, chaos erupted. A shot rang out from the darkness outside Clara. Her bullet shattered the lantern in Silas's hand, plunging the church into a disorienting gloom, lit only by the storm's occasional flashes of lightning. Cade charged forward. He slammed into one of the guards, while the other opened fire blindly into the dark. Sheriff Brody panicked, fired toward the doorway. Cade fought with a desperate primal fury. He disarmed the guard and threw him into the collapsing altar. He turned just in time to see Silas, his face a mask of incandescent rage, tackling Doc Miller, holding a knife to his throat. "I'll kill him myself." Suddenly, another timber high above them cracked and then gave way. A massive section of the roof began to collapse, raining down splintered wood and dust directly over Silas and the doctor. There was no time to think. Cade saw it all in a horrifying split-second tableau, Silas consumed by his revenge. The innocent doctor about to be crushed. The falling debris that would kill them both. He had a clear shot at Silas. He could end it, fulfill the role of the killer Silas believed him to be. Instead, he lunged. He shoved the doctor out of the way with one arm and tackled Silas with the other, pushing them both clear, just as the roof caved in with a deafening crash. They landed in a heap, Cade, Silas, and the corrupt sheriff, who had been caught by the edge of the collapse. The dust began to settle. The storm outside seemed to momentarily hold its breath. Cade rose, bruised, and battered, his pistol still in his hand. Silas lay on the ground, his leg trapped and broken beneath a heavy beam, his face contorted in agony and disbelief. Sheriff Brody was unconscious nearby. Clara rushed in, her rifle ready. She saw Silas pinned and helpless. Cade stood over him, his gun aimed at the man's heart. This was the moment, the moral crossroads. Kill him and embrace the identity of Jedediah Cain forever, or spare him and truly become Cade. He looked at Silas, at the pathetic, hate-filled man trapped in the ruins of his own vengeance. He saw not a monster, but a man broken by grief, a man he had helped to break. Killing him would not undo the past. It would only chain him to it. Slowly, deliberately, Cade lowered his gun. "It's over, Silas," he said, his voice ragged but clear. Silas stared up at him, his chest heaving with sobs of fury and pain. "You should have let me die," he wept. "No," Clara said, stepping forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "That would be your way, not ours." Her words hung in the dusty air, a final verdict. Cade had faced his past and chosen not to become it. Redemption wasn't about vengeance, it was about mercy. In the eerie calm that followed the storm's fury, the townsfolk of Providence emerged from their homes. Guided by the wreckage of the church, they found a scene of devastation and revelation. They saw Doc Miller, shaken but alive, being helped by Clara. They saw their corrupt sheriff groaning and pinned by a beam, his betrayal laid bare. And they saw Cade standing over the defeated Silas Croft, his gun holstered, his face grim, but his hands clean. Henderson and the blacksmith organized a group of men. They arrested the conscious members of Croft's gang and hauled the injured Sheriff Brody to the town jail. Another group worked together to free Silas, his face a mask of silent, agonizing defeat, as they splinted his broken leg. The hate had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a hollow, empty void. Justice in Providence would no longer be bought. It would be earned. As the morning sun broke through the retreating clouds, washing the battered town in a pale, clean light, Cade finally stood alone with Clara. They were in the middle of the ruined church, the air thick with the smell of dust and rain-soaked wood. The weight of the night and of the last 7 years settled on Cade's shoulders. "He's alive," Cade said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They'll send him to the territorial prison. He'll live out his days a broken man." "And you?" Clara asked softly, her gaze searching his face. "Are you a free one?" He finally turned to face her, fully the confession he had given her before now needing to be finished. "When I left my old life, I took something," he said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out the small, dented silver locket. He opened the clasp. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, faded and worn, a smiling woman with kind eyes and a serious-looking man. Eleanor and Silas Croft. I tore it from her neck as she was dying. I've carried it ever since, a reminder of what I cost them. He held it out to her. Clara looked from the locket to his face, at the profound shame etched there. She didn't take it. Instead, she gently closed his fingers over it. "You didn't carry it as a trophy, Cade," she said, her voice filled with a deep, knowing empathy. "You carried it as a penance. You carried it because you couldn't forget them. A killer wouldn't do that. Jedediah Cain might have caused that fire, but it was Cade who mourned for them every day since." Her acceptance was a key turning a lock deep inside him. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart crumbled, and for the first time in years he let himself feel the full crushing weight of his grief and the first fragile flicker of forgiveness. He didn't deserve it, he knew. But she was offering it anyway. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and held on as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had been ripped apart and put back together again. The man who had once brought fire and ruin now stood in the wreckage, holding onto the woman who had shown him how to rebuild. Months later, when the first snows of winter had melted and the prairie was reborn in a blush of green, Cade and Clara rode west. They left their homestead, now truly theirs, in the care of a neighboring family, who, like the rest of Providence, now looked upon Cade not with suspicion, but with a quiet, earned respect. Their journey had a single somber purpose. They found what was left of redemption. It was a ghost town in the truest sense, a collection of charred foundations and skeletal remains of buildings being slowly reclaimed by weeds and wind. The tailor shop was gone, marked only by a rectangle of blackened earth and a few scattered fire-warped bricks. Near the edge of the dead town, under a solitary twisted oak, were 3 simple wooden crosses, weathered and anonymous. The graves of Silas Croft's family. No one had known their names to carve them. Cade dismounted and walked to the graves, Clara a few steps behind him. He stood there for a long time, the prairie wind whispering through the tall grass. He wasn't asking for forgiveness from the dead. That was a grace he had no right to expect. This was an act of remembrance, of acknowledging the lives he had irrevocably altered. He took out the silver locket. He polished it on his sleeve, the metal warm from his touch. He knelt by the middle cross, the one he knew belonged to Eleanor Croft, and gently placed the locket at its base, letting it rest against the weathered wood. He was returning what he had stolen, a symbolic release of the burden he had carried for so long. He was not burying his past, but making peace with it. As he stood, Clara came and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. They stood together, 2 scarred but resilient figures, against the vast, empty landscape. The ghosts of redemption were finally quiet. They mounted their horses to begin the long ride back to their homestead, back to their future. As they prepared to leave, Clara pulled a folded yellowed letter from her saddlebag. "This came last week," she said, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. "It's from a lawyer back east. It's about my parents' original deed to the land." Cade looked at her puzzled. "The railroad survey finally went through," she explained, her eyes shining. "The deed my father filed included rights to any water sources on the property. According to the surveyor, there's a hidden spring high up in the rocky part of our land. A strong one. It's been there all along. We'll never have to worry about a well running dry again." Cade stared at her, then at the letter, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first truly unburdened smile Clara had ever seen on him. It wasn't a promise of riches, but something far more valuable: security. A foundation upon which they could truly build. Their future was no longer a question of survival, but of life. He reached over and took her hand again, his grip firm and sure. They turned their horses east toward home. They rode away from the ruins of redemption, not as a man running from his past and a woman clinging to hers, but as 2 people riding toward a shared horizon, their homestead waiting not as a refuge, but as a beginning.